Sometimes life waits until a man loses everything before showing him what was hidden beneath the ruins. The rain began somewhere beyond the hills of Mercer County and followed Ethan Calloway all the way home. It tapped softly against the windshield of his old Ford pickup, blurring the empty Tulane highway into streaks of silver and gray. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat darkened by rainwater and amber eyes that seemed to notice things long before Ethan ever could. The dog rested silently in the passenger seat, alert but calm, his ears twitching whenever thunder rolled across the distant mountains. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the folded divorce papers lying beside a half-empty thermos of black coffee. 3 weeks earlier, he had walked out of a courtroom in Pittsburgh with no house, no savings worth mentioning, and no marriage left to salvage. 20 years together had ended with a few signatures and a silence colder than any winter he remembered overseas. He did not blame Lauren anymore. Somewhere along the years, grief had settled between them like dust in an abandoned room, coating every conversation until neither of them could breathe inside it. By the time she asked for the divorce, Ethan had already felt gone for a long while. The truck rattled as he crossed the old county bridge leading toward Blackwater Ridge. The town looked smaller than he remembered. The gas station near the creek had closed. The grocery store sign hung crooked above cracked windows. Even the church steeple looked tired beneath the storm clouds gathering over the valley. Ethan had not planned to come back here. But when a man runs out of places to go, memory becomes the last address left. The farmhouse appeared near dusk, sitting alone beyond a field of tall dead grass that swayed beneath the wind like waves on a dark ocean. The house had belonged to his father once, though nobody had lived there since the funeral 8 years ago. Its white paint had faded into a tired gray, and part of the porch roof sagged beneath years of rain and snow. One upstairs window knocked softly against the frame as if the house itself were restless. Ethan parked beside the barn and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Ranger moved. The world outside felt suspended in that strange quiet that arrives just before heavy rain. Then Ranger lifted his head slowly. His ears stiffened toward the house. A low sound rolled from his throat, not quite a growl, not fear either. Recognition. Ethan glanced at him. "You feel it too, huh?" he murmured. Ranger stepped down from the truck first, boots of soft paws crunching against wet gravel. The dog stood motionless beside the porch, staring toward the darkened windows with intense focus. Ethan grabbed his duffel bag and followed slowly, the old wooden steps groaning beneath his weight. The smell inside the farmhouse hit him instantly. Dust, cedar, damp wood, and beneath it all, something older. The scent of years left untouched. Faint moonlight slipped through the thin curtains, painting pale shapes across the living room floor. His father's recliner still sat near the stone fireplace exactly where it had always been. Ethan swallowed hard. Some places do not forget the people who leave them. Ranger patted ahead through the hallway, nails clicking softly against the hardwood. Then suddenly he stopped near the kitchen pantry door. His body stiffened. One paw lifted slightly above the floorboards. His ears tilted forward toward something Ethan could not hear. A soft whine escaped his throat. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Ranger lowered his nose near the wood and exhaled slowly. The floor beneath him gave the faintest creak. And somewhere deep below the old farmhouse, something answered back. The sound beneath the floor came again just after midnight. Not loud, not violent. A slow metallic thud somewhere deep below the farmhouse, followed by silence, so complete Ethan could hear the rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. He sat upright on the old couch near the fireplace, every muscle tense from instinct he thought he had left behind years ago. Ranger was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the pantry doorway with his head lowered and ears fixed toward the floorboards. The dog gave one quiet huff through his nose, then scratched the wood once with deliberate precision. Ethan rubbed a hand across his tired face and reached for the flashlight resting beside his boots. The farmhouse creaked softly around him as wind pressed against the walls. Outside, the storm had settled into a cold, steady rain that washed silver across the dark fields surrounding the property. He crossed the room slowly, the beam of the flashlight cutting through dust drifting in the stale air. Ranger stepped aside but did not move far. His amber eyes followed Ethan closely, alert and watchful. The pantry door groaned when Ethan pulled it open. Shelves lined the narrow space from floor to ceiling, still crowded with forgotten jars, rusted soup cans, and old mason bottles clouded by time. The smell of cedar and damp earth lingered heavily inside. Ranger nudged Ethan's leg once, then lowered his nose toward the floor again. Ethan crouched carefully, sweeping the flashlight over the warped wooden boards beneath the lowest shelf. At first, nothing looked unusual, just old pine darkened with age. But then he noticed faint scratches near the edges of one plank, thin marks worn smooth by repeated movement. He pressed his fingers against the wood. It shifted slightly beneath his hand. Ranger immediately stiffened. Ethan felt his pulse slow into that strange calm that sometimes comes before discovery. He set the flashlight on the floor and wedged his fingers beneath the loose plank. The wood resisted for a moment before lifting with a dry groan that echoed through the pantry. Dust swirled upward into the flashlight beam like smoke. Beneath the plank sat a small metal box no larger than a Bible, its surface coated with years of grime. Ranger stepped closer and sniffed it carefully, tail low but steady. Ethan stared at the box for several long seconds. His father had never been sentimental. Thomas Calloway believed in hard work, silence, and fixing things with your hands before talking about them. Yet something about the hidden box felt personal, intentional. Ethan wiped away the dust with his sleeve and found an engraving across the lid. TC 1978. His father's initials. The year Ethan was born. A cold shiver moved quietly through his chest. He carried the box into the living room and sat beside the firelight. The lock had already rusted apart with age. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch, a folded map stained yellow at the edges, and a small handwritten note. Ethan recognized his father's handwriting instantly. Sharp block letters pressed hard into the paper as if carved instead of written. He unfolded the note carefully. If you are reading this, then the house has finally decided to trust you. Ethan frowned softly. The words sounded unlike his father somehow, almost gentle. Ranger climbed onto the rug beside him and rested his chin across Ethan's knee while rain whispered against the windows. Ethan continued reading slowly. There are things beneath this land that men once tried to buy from me. I told them no. Some secrets should wait for the right hands. When everything feels lost, listen beneath the house. The dog will know where to begin. Ethan lowered the paper without speaking. The fire crackled softly beside him. Ranger suddenly lifted his head again. His ears turned sharply toward the hallway leading deeper into the farmhouse. Then, from somewhere below the floorboards, came another slow metallic thud. Morning arrived slowly over Blackwater Ridge, wrapped in pale fog and the smell of wet earth rising from the fields beyond the farmhouse. Ethan had barely slept. The note from his father rested beside an untouched cup of coffee on the kitchen table, while Ranger sat near the back door watching the tree line with quiet concentration. The metallic sound beneath the house had stopped sometime before dawn, but the feeling it left behind still lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. Ethan stepped onto the porch with his flannel jacket pulled tight against the cold. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof into puddles scattered across the yard. Beyond the field, the old barn leaned slightly beneath decades of storms, its faded red paint peeling away like dried leaves. He remembered helping his father repair that roof one summer when he was 12 years old. Back then the property had still felt alive. Chickens wandered the grass. The garden behind the house stretched nearly 50 feet along the fence. His mother used to hang laundry beside the apple tree while old country music drifted through the kitchen windows. Strange how grief could hollow out a place without moving a single board. Ranger trotted down the porch steps ahead of him, nose low to the ground. Ethan followed across the muddy yard, boots sinking softly into the soaked earth. The morning wind carried the scent of pine, rust, and distant rain moving through the hills. Ranger stopped halfway to the barn and turned sharply toward the side of the farmhouse instead. His ears stood high. Then he moved with sudden purpose toward a narrow cellar door almost completely hidden beneath thick ivy vines crawling along the stone foundation. Ethan slowed. He had forgotten the cellar even existed. The door sat partially buried beneath years of leaves and mud, warped with age and stained dark from moisture. Ranger pawed once at the vines, then looked back at Ethan expectantly. "All right," Ethan murmured quietly. "Show me." Together they cleared away the wet ivy and branches until the old iron handles finally appeared beneath the debris. Ethan gripped them carefully and pulled. The doors resisted at first before opening with a deep groan that echoed hollowly underground. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below, carrying the scent of stone, cedar, and something metallic hidden far beneath the earth. Ranger stood completely still beside the opening. Not afraid. Listening. Ethan switched on the flashlight and aimed the beam downward. Narrow concrete steps disappeared into shadow beneath the house. Water dripped steadily somewhere below, slow and rhythmic like a distant clock. He descended carefully, one hand trailing against the rough stone wall. Ranger stayed close at his side, shoulders tense beneath his thick coat. The cellar opened into a long underground corridor Ethan did not remember from childhood. Shelves lined the walls holding dusty glass jars, rusted tools, and wooden crates stamped with faded military markings from decades earlier. His flashlight beam swept across old copper pipes running along the ceiling before settling on something at the far end of the corridor. A steel door, heavy, reinforced, completely out of place beneath a Pennsylvania farmhouse. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. The surface of the door carried scratches and weather stains, but one detail remained untouched by time. A symbol etched directly into the steel. The same symbol engraved on the pocket watch from the metal box upstairs. Ranger moved forward slowly until he stood directly before the door. Then the German shepherd lowered his head and released a soft whine almost filled with recognition. Ethan stepped closer. Mounted beside the steel frame was a small brass plate covered in dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve and felt the breath leave his lungs. Property of Callaway Mineral Survey Division. Established 1962. Ethan blinked hard. His father had never mentioned any mineral company. Never once. Another slow metallic thud echoed from somewhere beyond the steel door, this time louder than before. The sound behind the steel door did not come again for several seconds. Yet the silence that followed felt heavier somehow, as if the underground corridor itself were holding its breath. Ethan stood motionless beneath the dim flashlight beam while cold air drifted through the cellar carrying the scent of iron and wet stone. Ranger remained planted directly before the door, muscles rigid beneath his thick fur, amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the steel. Ethan swallowed slowly and stepped closer to inspect the frame. Dust covered most of the surface, but years had not erased the careful engineering of it. Thick hinges, reinforced locking bars. Whoever built this place had intended for it to stay hidden. He brushed his hand along the brass plate again, trying to make sense of the words etched into the metal. Callaway Mineral Survey Division. The name sounded impossible beside memories of his father fixing tractors and stacking hay beneath the summer sun. Thomas Callaway had lived like a quiet farmer, not a businessman. Not a man connected to underground steel vaults beneath family farmland. Ethan's flashlight swept lower until the beam caught something mounted beside the locking mechanism. A narrow key slot. Old-fashioned. Mechanical. He froze for a moment as realization settled quietly into place. The pocket watch upstairs. His father's box. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed the silver watch carefully. Rainwater from outside still clung faintly to the chain. He turned it over beneath the flashlight. Along the edge of the casing, nearly invisible unless the light struck perfectly, was a small engraved notch shaped exactly like the key slot before him. "No way," Ethan whispered under his breath. Ranger shifted slightly beside him, ears flicking toward the corridor behind them before returning to the door. Ethan pressed his thumb against the notch and twisted. With a soft metallic click, the back of the watch opened farther than before. Hidden inside beneath the gears rested a tiny brass key wrapped carefully in faded cloth. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. For a long moment, he simply stood there listening to the slow drip of water echoing through the cellar while old memories surfaced unexpectedly from childhood. His father locking the basement whenever strangers visited. Late nights when trucks arrived near the property after midnight. Conversations that stopped whenever Ethan entered the room. Things he had never questioned because children rarely imagine their parents carry entire worlds hidden beneath ordinary life. Ranger let out a low, impatient whine. Ethan exhaled slowly and inserted the brass key into the steel door. The mechanism resisted at first. Then with a deep grinding sound that echoed through the corridor, the lock finally turned. Dust trembled loose from the ceiling overhead. The heavy door opened inward several inches before stopping on its own. A wave of cold air drifted outward, carrying the scent of minerals, cedar wood, and something startlingly clean beneath the earth. Ethan aimed the flashlight inside. His breath caught immediately. The chamber beyond looked untouched by time. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with rolled maps, survey tools, leather-bound ledgers, and glass lanterns coated in only a thin layer of dust. At the center stood a long oak table beneath a hanging industrial lamp connected to old copper wiring overhead. On the far wall, spread an enormous map of the surrounding mountains covered in markings, notes, and colored pins. But none of it held Ethan's attention for long, because beside the table sat a photograph in a silver frame. His mother smiling beneath summer sunlight. Younger, happy, standing beside Thomas Calloway near a flowing creek Ethan had never seen before. Written carefully across the bottom of the frame were 6 simple words. For the day he comes home. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Ranger stepped quietly into the room ahead of him, claws tapping softly against the concrete floor. Then suddenly the dog stopped near the far corner beside an old filing cabinet. His ears lifted sharply. Another sound echoed faintly beneath the floor. Not metal this time. Water moving somewhere deep below the chamber. The sound of water beneath the chamber followed Ethan through the rest of the night, like a distant memory, refusing to fade. He barely noticed the cold anymore. Hours passed while he moved slowly around the underground room, sweeping dust from ledgers, opening brittle maps, and trying to understand the hidden life his father had built beneath the farmhouse. Ranger remained near the far corner beside the filing cabinet, alert and unusually still, his ears twitching each time the faint current echoed below the concrete floor. The deeper Ethan looked, the stranger the room became. Survey charts covered nearly every wall, marked with handwritten measurements stretching across miles of mountain land surrounding Blackwater Ridge. Old photographs showed crews standing near streams and rock formations Ethan had never seen before. In every picture, Thomas Calloway stood near the edge of the frame, never smiling fully, always watching something beyond the camera. Near dawn, Ethan opened one of the leather-bound ledgers resting on the oak table. The pages crackled softly beneath his fingers. Numbers filled most of the entries at first. Coordinates, soil reports, water analysis. Then midway through the book, the writing changed. The careful business notes gave way to personal journal entries written in his father's unmistakable block lettering. September 14th, 1987. The spring is stronger than ever. Clean enough to bottle straight from the source. Men from Harrisburg offered me nearly $500,000 today. Told them no again. Some things are not meant to belong to corporations. Ethan frowned and turned another page. October 2nd, 1989. Eleanor believes this place was given to us for a reason. She says water remembers kindness. I do not understand that yet, but she smiles whenever she says it. Ethan stopped reading for a moment. His mother's name settled heavily in the quiet chamber. Eleanor Calloway had died when he was 19. Cancer had taken her slowly during one long winter that still haunted certain corners of his memory. After she passed, his father became quieter every year until silence seemed to replace him entirely. Ethan had spent most of his life believing grief alone changed the man. But now, sitting beneath the farmhouse surrounded by hidden maps and buried secrets, he wondered how much of his father had always remained concealed behind locked doors and unfinished conversations. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the back wall of the chamber. His nails clicked sharply against the concrete before stopping beside an old utility panel covered in dust. The dog lowered his head and pressed his nose near the floor. Then came 3 short barks. Deliberate, focused. The same pattern Ethan remembered from overseas whenever Ranger detected something important. Ethan crossed the room quickly and aimed the flashlight downward. At first he saw only cracks running through the concrete near the base of the wall. Then the beam caught moisture shimmering faintly between them. Water. Clear water slowly rising through the stone from somewhere far below. Ethan knelt carefully and touched the surface with his fingertips. Ice cold. Fresh. Cleaner than any groundwater he had ever felt. Ranger stared at him intently while the sound beneath the chamber grew slightly louder. Not dangerous. Rhythmic. Alive somehow. Ethan followed the crack line along the floor until it disappeared beneath a heavy steel cabinet bolted against the wall. Together he and Ranger pushed against it slowly. Rust groaned. Dust spiraled into the flashlight beam. When the cabinet finally shifted aside, Ethan felt his heartbeat stumble. Hidden behind it was another narrow door built directly into the concrete foundation, smaller than the first steel vault door upstairs. Older too. A faded wooden sign hung crookedly above the frame. Spring access. Authorized family only. Ethan stared at the words while cold air drifted steadily through the cracks around the door, carrying the clean scent of flowing mountain water. Then Ranger stepped forward and gently rested his head against Ethan's shoulder, as if the dog already understood something Ethan had not fully realized yet. Whatever his father had hidden beneath Blackwater Ridge was never meant to stay buried forever. By late afternoon, the storm clouds had finally broken apart above Blackwater Ridge, allowing thin bands of sunlight to spill across the valley like pale gold through cathedral windows. Ethan stood alone inside the underground chamber, staring at the narrow door marked spring access, while Ranger paced quietly beside him. The air around the doorway felt colder than the rest of the room, touched by a steady breath of moisture rising from somewhere deep beneath the mountain. Ethan rested his hand against the old handle and hesitated. Some part of him still expected to wake up on the couch upstairs with rain against the windows and grief pressing against his chest like it always had. But the steel vault, the hidden journals, the underground maps, all of it was real. His father had built an entire hidden world beneath the farmhouse, and somehow Ethan had spent most of his life walking above it without ever knowing. Ranger stepped closer and nudged Ethan's arm gently with his nose. The familiar gesture grounded him. Ethan exhaled slowly and pulled the handle downward. The narrow door opened inward with a sharp creak that echoed softly through the concrete chamber. Beyond it stretched a stone tunnel reinforced with old timber beams darkened by age and moisture. Dim industrial lights lined the ceiling overhead, surprisingly still functional, glowing faint amber against the wet rock walls. Water dripped steadily nearby, not in random scattered drops, but in the steady rhythm of a flowing current hidden further ahead. Ethan moved carefully down the tunnel with Ranger close at his side. The farther they walked, the cooler the air became. The smell changed too. Less like damp earth now. Cleaner. Fresher. Like snowmelt running over mountain stone. After nearly 50 yards, the narrow passage widened suddenly into a cavern, so large Ethan stopped walking entirely. Before him stretched an underground spring unlike anything he had imagined possible beneath the family land. Crystal clear water flowed through the center of the cavern in a slow glowing stream illuminated by shafts of pale natural light, filtering through cracks high above in the rock ceiling. The surface shimmered silver and blue like liquid glass. Moss covered the stones surrounding the water, glowing deep green beneath the soft light. The entire cavern carried a strange stillness that felt almost sacred. Ranger moved forward first, stepping carefully to the edge of the stream. The German shepherd lowered his head and drank quietly from the water before lifting his gaze toward Ethan. Calm. Peaceful. Ethan crouched beside the spring and dipped his hand into the current. The water was impossibly cold and startlingly pure. For the first time in years, he felt something inside him loosen slightly, some invisible weight he had carried so long he no longer noticed it. His father's final journal entries suddenly returned to him with painful clarity. Some things are not meant to belong to corporations. Ethan looked around the cavern again and finally understood. This was never about hidden wealth alone. The spring beneath Blackwater Ridge was untouched mountain water, powerful enough to supply entire counties. In the wrong hands, it would have become another industrial operation carved into the hills until nothing living remained. Thomas Calloway had protected it all these years by pretending to be nothing more than a quiet farmer, fading slowly into obscurity. Ranger barked once softly toward the far side of the cavern. Ethan followed the sound and noticed a small wooden box resting on a flat stone beside the stream. He crossed carefully and opened it. Inside lay a sealed envelope, addressed in his father's handwriting. For Ethan, only when you are ready. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. Son, if you found this place, then life has already taken enough from you to finally understand why some things must be protected instead of sold. This spring saved our family once during the drought of 1968. It gave this valley life long before any of us arrived. Promise me one thing. Do not let greedy men poison what God placed beneath these mountains. Build something good here instead. Ethan lowered the letter slowly while the underground stream whispered softly through the cavern beside him. Ranger sat quietly at his side, staring up toward him with steady amber eyes filled with the same calm loyalty that had carried them through every broken road behind them. For the first time since the divorce, since the courtroom, since the long empty years after war, Ethan no longer felt like a man returning to ruins. He felt like someone finally arriving where he was always meant to be. The days that followed settled gently over Blackwater Ridge like the slow return of spring after a brutal winter. Ethan found himself waking before sunrise each morning, not because of old habits from military life, but because the farmhouse no longer felt empty. The silence inside it had changed. It no longer carried the hollow ache of abandonment. Instead, the old house seemed to breathe quietly around him, warmed by the crackling fire in the stone hearth and the steady sound of Ranger moving through the rooms with calm familiarity. Outside, November winds swept across the fields carrying the scent of pine needles and cold mountain water drifting unseen beneath the earth below. Ethan spent most mornings repairing the farmhouse little by little. He patched sections of the sagging porch roof, replaced broken fence posts along the pasture, and cleared years of weeds from the garden behind the barn. Ranger stayed close through all of it, watching the tree line, ears lifting whenever unfamiliar vehicles passed on the distant county road. Sometimes Ethan caught himself talking to the dog the way lonely men often speak to creatures that never judge them. "Your grand plan worked, huh?" he murmured one afternoon while repairing the old porch steps. Ranger responded with a slow wag of his tail before returning his attention toward the hills beyond the property. The hidden spring remained untouched beneath the mountain. Ethan visited it every evening just before sunset. Each time he stepped into the underground cavern, the weight inside his chest seemed to ease a little more. The clear water flowed endlessly through the stone like something ancient and patient, unconcerned with divorce papers, failed marriages, or the long scars men carried home from distant wars. Some places healed quietly simply by existing. One cold morning, a dusty pickup truck rolled into the driveway while Ethan stacked firewood beside the barn. Ranger noticed the visitor first. The German shepherd stood immediately, alert but calm, watching the truck approach with focused amber eyes. An older man stepped out slowly, wrapped in a brown canvas coat weathered by years outdoors. His white beard moved softly in the wind as he removed his hat. "You Thomas Calloway's boy?" he asked gently. Ethan nodded cautiously. "Name's Walter Green," the man said. "Ran survey crews with your father back in the 70s. Ethan felt his pulse tighten slightly. "You knew about all this?" Walter glanced toward the farmhouse before answering. "Not all of it. Your father trusted very few people. But I knew enough to understand why he stayed here guarding this land instead of getting rich off it." Ranger approached slowly and sniffed the man's hand before settling calmly beside Ethan. Walter smiled faintly. "That dog trusts people better than most men do." They sat together on the porch drinking black coffee while pale sunlight spread across the valley below. Walter explained how companies had spent decades trying to buy mineral rights throughout Blackwater Ridge after discovering the underground spring system beneath the mountains. The water carried unusually pure mineral content worth millions to bottling corporations and developers. "Your father turned them down every single time," Walter said quietly. "Folks thought he was stubborn. Truth is, he knew what would happen. Once they got their hands on these hills, they would tear the mountains open until nothing living remained." Ethan stared toward the distant tree line while wind stirred the dead grass around the farmhouse. "Why leave it to me?" he asked softly. Walter looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because broken men understand the value of protecting things better than anyone else." The words settled heavily between them. Ranger rested his head across Ethan's boot, as if sensing the ache beneath the silence. Before leaving, Walter reached into his coat pocket and handed Ethan a folded document sealed inside a weatherproof sleeve. "Your father wanted you to have this when the time was right." Ethan opened it carefully after the truck disappeared down the road. Inside rested legal ownership papers for over 400 acres surrounding Blackwater Ridge, including full water rights beneath the mountain spring. Attached to the final page was one handwritten sentence from Thomas Calloway. "Wealth means very little unless it leaves something beautiful behind." Winter settled fully over Blackwater Ridge by early December, covering the hills in soft layers of frost that glittered beneath the morning sun like powdered silver. Smoke curled steadily from the farmhouse chimney now, a quiet sign that life had returned to a place long abandoned by warmth. Ethan stood near the pasture fence one cold afternoon, watching Ranger sprint through the snow with the easy strength of a dog finally at peace. The German shepherd bounded across the frozen field before stopping suddenly near the old apple tree where Ethan's mother once tied ribbons during summer festivals when he was a child. Ranger barked once sharply, tail wagging low, then pawed at the snow beneath the tree roots. Ethan smiled faintly and walked over carrying an armful of fence tools. "You always find something, do not you?" he murmured. Ranger continued pawing carefully until the edge of a rusted metal tin emerged from beneath the frozen ground. Ethan knelt and pulled it free, brushing away dirt and ice with gloved hands. Inside rested dozens of old photographs wrapped in cloth along with several letters tied neatly together using faded blue ribbon. He recognized his mother's handwriting immediately. Eleanor Calloway had written each envelope carefully in looping cursive, dated across nearly 20 years of family life. Ethan sat beneath the apple tree while cold wind drifted gently through the valley around him. Ranger curled beside him in the snow, resting calmly against his leg while Ethan opened the first letter. Most were simple things. Stories about planting tomatoes behind the barn. Notes about thunderstorms moving through the mountains. Memories of Ethan as a boy chasing fireflies across the pasture while his father pretended not to smile watching him. But deeper into the stack, the letters became more personal, more honest than anything his parents had ever spoken aloud. "Your father worries too much about protecting this place," one letter read. "He believes the world destroys anything beautiful once money enters the room. But I still believe kindness survives longer than greed if someone brave enough chooses to guard it." Ethan lowered the paper slowly. Snowflakes drifted across the field in complete silence. For years he had carried the belief that his family slowly fell apart after his mother died, that grief hollowed the farmhouse until nothing living remained. But now he understood something different. His parents had not simply guarded land or water beneath the mountain. They had protected an idea, that some places still deserved to remain untouched by selfishness, that healing mattered more than profit, that a man could build a meaningful life quietly without needing the world's applause. Days later, Ethan drove into town for supplies with Ranger seated beside him as always. The small hardware store near the old church buzzed softly with local conversation and the smell of cedar shavings warming beside an iron stove. For the first time since returning home, people greeted Ethan by name instead of cautious nods. Old farmers asked about the farmhouse repairs. The diner waitress packed fresh pie slices for the soldier and his dog. Even the children outside the post office waved excitedly when Ranger stepped from the truck. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle inside him as he stood beneath the pale winter sky holding bags of nails and feed supplies. Belonging. Not the loud kind built on achievement or praise. The quieter kind. The kind earned slowly through presence, honesty, and staying when life gives every reason to leave. That evening he returned to the underground spring carrying one of his mother's letters folded carefully inside his coat pocket. The cavern glowed softly beneath lantern light, while crystal water flowed endlessly through ancient stone. Ranger drank from the edge of the stream before settling nearby. Ethan unfolded the final letter and read the last lines beneath the whisper of moving water. "Someday this place will find you again when your heart is tired enough to finally hear it." The cavern fell silent except for the steady current moving beneath Blackwater Ridge. Ethan stared into the clear water for a long time while snow drifted softly somewhere above the mountain. Then slowly, for the first time in many years, he smiled without forcing it. Christmas arrived quietly over Blackwater Ridge beneath a sky the color of silver smoke. Snow covered the farmhouse roof in a soft white blanket, and warm light glowed through the windows where darkness had once lived for years untouched. Ethan stood on the porch early that morning holding a steaming mug of coffee while Ranger rested beside him watching pale sunlight spill slowly across the frozen valley. The world felt still in the way only winter mornings can feel, as though time itself had paused long enough for broken things to heal. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, word had spread quietly through the county about the Calloway property and the underground spring hidden beneath the mountain. Ethan never spoke publicly about the cavern or the water itself, but people noticed the changes around the farmhouse. Delivery trucks arrived carrying lumber and equipment. Local workers repaired the old well house and restored the abandoned greenhouse behind the barn. Families struggling through the winter suddenly found fresh produce boxes left anonymously on their porches. The church pantry received steady donations of bottled spring water with simple labels. That red Blackwater Ridge spring. No company logo. No price tags. Just a small line printed beneath the name. Freely given. One snowy afternoon, Ethan transformed the old barn into a warming shelter for travelers caught along the county roads during storms. Ranchers brought extra blankets. Teachers donated children's books. A retired nurse volunteered medical supplies. Somehow, the empty property his father spent decades protecting slowly became the heart of the valley again. Rangers seemed to understand every part of it before anyone else did. The German shepherd greeted visitors at the gate with calm, watchful eyes, escorting nervous children through the snow toward the farmhouse porch as though he had always belonged there. Some evenings, Ethan sat beside the fireplace watching neighbors laugh quietly over bowls of soup while winter wind rattled softly against the windows outside. Those moments felt stranger to him than discovering the underground spring. For years, he had believed his life would continue shrinking until nothing meaningful remained. Instead, everything lost had somehow guided him back towards something larger than himself. On Christmas Eve, the valley was hit by a heavy snowstorm just after sunset. Thick snowflakes swirled through the darkness while wind moved across the mountains with a low, ancient hum. Ethan spent most of the evening checking generators and helping a stranded family settle into the barn shelter. By midnight, the storm finally softened into silence. Ethan walked alone toward the underground cavern carrying an old lantern while Ranger padded faithfully beside him through the fresh snow. The hidden spring glowed softly beneath the mountain exactly as it always had, untouched by the storm above. Ethan stood beside the water for a long time listening to the gentle current move through the ancient stone. He thought about his father, about Eleanor's letters, about the strange invisible road that had led him from a courthouse filled with loss all the way back to this quiet sacred place beneath Blackwater Ridge. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the cavern entrance. Footsteps echoed softly through the tunnel. Ethan turned, as Walter Green emerged carrying a small wooden box beneath one arm. Snow dusted the old man's coat and beard. "Thought your father would want you to have this tonight," Walter said gently. Inside the box rested a weathered photograph Ethan had never seen before. Thomas and Eleanor Calloway stood beside the underground spring decades earlier, younger and smiling beneath lantern light. In the center of the picture sat a small boy no older than 6 wrapped in a winter coat, laughing while a German shepherd puppy climbed awkwardly into his lap. Written carefully across the back were Eleanor's final words. Home was never the farmhouse. Home was the goodness waiting beneath it. Ethan lowered the photograph slowly while tears blurred the lantern light around him. Ranger pressed quietly against his side, warm and steady as always. Above them, the mountains slept beneath fresh snow and silver moonlight, guarding their secrets in silence. But deep beneath Blackwater Ridge, where crystal water flowed endlessly through ancient stone, a weary veteran finally understood something his father had known all along. Sometimes miracles do not arrive to change your life. Sometimes they wait patiently beneath the surface until you are finally ready to come home. Hi friend, before you go, if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you why respect matters, please hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and share this video so more people around the world can hear stories that deserve to be heard. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. Thank you for listening, story.